Welcome back to the van conversion. Hopefully by this point, after doing all of the bodywork, framing, making holes on the roof, and even replacing the windshield, you already know what your electrical system is going to look like. So let's talk wiring. It is really important for you to have a plan, because it's a lot easier to make the wires reach their desired locations now before we put insulation in the van and we start covering all the openings that it has. So first things first, you need a plan. And there are a different million ways to make a plan. I'm sure there's an app for it, but the simplest, easiest way, and what I did, is to make a drawing. And the important part of this drawing is that you mark the locations of your different electrical requirements. And these are the location of your outlets, the location of your lights and light switches, which appliances you're going to need and where you're going to put them, like the fridge, the water pump, or even the roof vent, what type of current they use, if they're AC or DC, and how many amps they need to run. And of course, in all of these plans, it's also really important for you to decide the location of your electrical system. Because then once you have all of that, you can figure out the length of wire that you need to power all the different appliances, and depending on their amp usage, what gauge the wire should be. And there are a ton of different calculators online to help you figure that out. Now that you have your final plan all nailed down, and you know how much wire and which gauge you're gonna need, let's talk about everything else you're gonna need to finish this process. And we're gonna start with conduit, which we're gonna use to guide the wires throughout the van. And you're gonna need different sizes depending on how many wires you're gonna pass through different locations and what gauge wire that's gonna be. Then you're gonna need a blade to trim that conduit to size, a drill and various drill bits, maybe a hole saw or two, some files to get rid of the burrs if you're drilling through metal, and then all of the previous calculated different lengths and gauges of wire, and a wire cutter to trim that down to size as well. Finally, some tape and a pen to correctly label and identify all of the wires that are going to be running throughout the van. Also, I am not an electrician, so take my advice with a little grain of salt. But now that we have everything we need, let's start figuring out where and how we're going to pass the wires. Since I'm going to put my electrical system underneath the bed, here in the middle on the driver's side, my biggest hurdles are going to be how to get the wires to the ceiling for some lights and the solar panels, as well as to the wall on the other side of the van. This one right here for the water system and some outlets that I'm going to need. And in terms of getting them to the ceiling, depending on how many wires you're trying to pass, you might be able to use the metal frame of the van as a channel and guiding them to the top. But it was a little bit too tight for the amount of cables that I wanted to pass, so I decided to make some holes. And for this, you just need to get a little hole saw that has a similar diameter to the conduit that you're going to use and start drilling. It's easy as that. For some harder to reach places, you can use a right angle drill and a step bit to achieve a similar result. Once all the metal is cut, just use a file to get rid of all the burrs, and then paint to protect from all the rust. Once that paint is dry and everything is safe to touch, we just need to measure the conduit, figure out how much we're going to need, and then get the blade and cut it, which is surprisingly easy. For some reason I thought conduit was a lot harder to cut. But then once everything is cut to size, you just put it in place and boom, you got a channel to get the wires to the ceiling. For my specific case, for this van and for the design of system that I did, those were the only holes that I needed to drill. I'm gonna need to drill one more hole for shore power, but that's on the ground and I can access it when I'm actually installing the electrical system. So for now, all we need to do is figure out how to get the wires to the front and the back of the van, at the top and at the ground level. In terms of getting the wires to this wall here on the other side of the electrical system, That's going to be easy in my case. I'm just going to pass the wires along the subfloor of the van. So now the only thing that's missing is figuring out how to get the wires to the front and the back of the van. At the top, we're actually pretty lucky because printers have these little shelves on each wall that Mercedes actually uses to get power from the front to the back for some lights and some other stuff that I don't know what it is. So we're gonna take advantage of that and put some conduit and pass some wires on both sides. At the ground level, the process is also very simple. There are a bunch of gaps in the framing that we can use to pass the wires. So we're just gonna use conduit to keep everything neat, tidy, and protect the wires from chafing in the middle, which could get dangerous in the long run. Now that all the conduit is in place, we need to start passing some wire through. But first, I needed to make some openings in the conduit for some outlets and some light switches. A couple extra tips for when you're actually finishing the install in the future are: 1. Label everything. I just used a little bit of painter's tape and a pen to correctly identify which wire is which. So when I'm doing the installation in the future, after I put all of the insulation in and built some frames for the cabinets, and I forgot which wire is which, I can just look at the label and know instantly. And the second tip is to leave a little bit more wire than you think you're gonna need. I like to do these little loops in the places that I know that I'm gonna be doing connections, either to lights or switches or whatever it is, just to have that little bit of extra space to allow me to maneuver and make the connections without having to pull on the wires and push things from other places. Just make my life a lot easier. So now that everything is in place, we can start with the insulation, which is going to be the next video. So remember to like this one if you enjoyed it or you learned something, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new videos about this vent conversion or maybe some of my travels. Now, see you in the next one. Bye! Making some holes on the roof and even... And now that you know everything you need... And now that you need ceiling for the rooftop, I'm gonna sneeze. This van and for the design that I made, those were the only... To correctly identify what wire is which wire is what.